York's classic rock, Q1043.
Good morning. And we have a new guest this morning, Kayleen Schaefer, who has written a book called But You're Still So Young, How 30-somethings Are Redefining Adulthood. So tell me the history of this book. Why'd you write this?
Hi, Shelley. Thank you so much for having me. I wrote this book in part because I lived through my 30s. I was at the end of my 30s and thinking, that's not how I expected this to go. And then I looked at all the statistics that showed that 30 somethings are approaching adult milestones later. And even though I looked at those statistics, I still thought like, did I do this right? Am I alone? And so I really wanted to talk to real people living in their 30s and watch as they approach their own adult milestones on their own timelines and really just put out the message that that is totally okay.
So there are certain expectations of what it means to be an adult, or at least there were. I mean, I just, in my life, Kayleen, I have never set goals for where I should be somewhere in life. I think maybe it was self-protection because I thought, well, what happens if you don't make those goals? Then in your mind, you're a failure, but you're not. These are very artificially defined, goalposts that to me should never exist. That I should have my first child at 30. I should be finished with my childbearing at 35. I should be making this amount of money by such and such. Why do we even have to think that way? And why do so many people think that way?
I think that that is a great philosophy, saying I have to do X by X age. That's wonderful. The reason that we think that way, I was shocked to find out, is adulthood was defined for us by sociologists in the 1950s. And it was defined by 5 steps, and they're very major steps. The first is finishing school. The second is leaving home. The third is becoming financially independent. The fourth is marrying, and those two could be flipped. And the fifth is having children. So, and most people in the 50s did that in their early teens or late or early 20s by the latest, sorry, late teens, early 20s. But that has rapidly, we've gotten older and older as we've checked these things off or said, I don't feel comfortable with that, or I don't want to do that, or that's not how I want to arrange my life. But since that definition was set 70 years ago, I really wondered, like, why was that still reverberating around my head and around a lot of other people's head, that we had to do this or we were doing life wrong. And it was very interesting to learn that we just still idealize that 1950s life and that period. And that's why that's still hanging around as the definition of adulthood.
It's so weird, though. I mean, it just doesn't make sense to me. What is your personal story? I mean, get a little more personal with where you were and where you ended up and how you feel.
My personal story is I lived my 20s very much in that classical find yourself, figure out who you are. Nothing has to be permanent. Like, this is about identity building and doing, what you feel like doing and exploring. But for whatever reason, probably because of this adult stereotype, I thought that when I hit my 30s, it was time to get serious. Okay, now I'm a serious adult. I'm 30. I'm going to check off all of these things in a line. But I barely established a career as an editor and a writer at that time. And I wasn't looking to get married. I wasn't sure if I wanted to hand in. My parents still helped me in small ways. And so, but I did think, okay, I'm in my 30s, instant adulthood. And then early in my 30s, I got laid off, which was just shocking to me because the thing that I had been trying to swing my life around was gone. I thought, I'll establish this career and this financial independence, and then I'll be ready to get married, and then I'll be ready to have kids. And when I was laid off, it just felt like that timeline that I had imposed on myself was completely blown apart. But as anxiety causing as it was also pretty freeing, because then I thought, well, okay, I don't have what I thought I was going to have. Now I can approach these milestones in my own way and really check in with myself. Does this feel right? So, I had romantic mishaps. I wasn't sure if I wanted to have a child, and was a decision I struggled for a long time with. And I do have a child now, but it was not something that I knew until the very end of my 30s that I wanted to do.
And when you had a child, were you part of a couple, or what was the situation?
Yes, I had a child with my boyfriend, but it was very much, I wrote about this in the book, is very much, okay, I would like to do this and I would like to do this with you. And it was very considered versus, I'm 34, we got to have kids. And so I felt much more comfortable making the decision and checking off that milestone.
See, now biologically, there is a deadline, when it comes to, and I do stress biologically, because adoption is always an option if you're wealthy. Surrogacy is also an option. There are just so many more options out there. What were your parents' reactions to your expectations and how you were handling all this? What did they tell you?
I am very lucky in that my parents did not put pressure on me to conform to an adulthood that they saw for me. However, by their own example, I knew, I wasn't quote unquote measuring up. They married when they were 26. They had me. They owned a house. My dad went to the same job every day, and my mom stayed home for much of my early childhood before going back to work. So their example and the example of every other nuclear family in the town in Texas where I grew up was that traditional adulthood.
I'm thinking that social media makes this so much worse on your generation, and even more so the younger generations that followed you, because every milestone is just blown up. Every event is blown up way out of proportion. I mean, I was kind of shocked when my kids started celebrating the big 5 birthdays. I said, when did that become a thing? A 5 birthday that, is as big as your 40th birthday? I could not get it. I understand and I embrace celebrating what we can in life, but they're celebrating, and then there's, an explosion that makes everyone else around you feel like crap if it's not as good as what you're doing.
Social media, as you very rightly say, it's just this high gloss, positive, I did this, yay, I did this. And we're all clapping and cheering each other on. And in part, I think that's excellent. We should celebrate whatever accomplishments we can get because, we're in a difficult place where it is harder to accomplish these things. But I also think that if that's all you're seeing and you yourself are not posting these things, you're sitting there scrolling and wondering, like, when is this going to happen for me? And you may become convinced that you have to do it, even if you checked in with yourself and didn't even want to do it. For the 8 people that I follow in this book and spent 2 years talking with, I made it a point to stay off of their social media. I didn't want to see that curated image that they present to the world. I wanted to know what was actually going on inside their head and what their fears were and what their anxieties were, and hear about them talk about their triumphs just personally without that artifice of social media.
I'm speaking with Kayleen Schaefer. She is the author of But You're Still So Young, How 30 Somethings Are Redefining Adulthood. You guys got hit harder than any other generation when it came to the 2008 recession, and now the pandemic. So tell us about that, how that has affected you and what you're seeing around you among your peers.
The financial part of this, as you said, is absolutely enormous. 30 somethings are going through their recession right now. So first in 2008 and now during the coronavirus pandemic. And, we're the gig workers, we're the freelancers. We don't have the same protection that workers did decades ago. And so we haven't been able to build up much of a financial safety net. And we're also carrying, in many cases, a huge amount of student debt, which also just doesn't help as far as becoming financially stable and getting to a place where you feel good about your finances. And it does make sense that you want to get to that place before, maybe marrying, before having children, before trying to buy a home. You have to. So all of the stories in the book are very tied up with the people's finances, and that touches really every decision that they make in their lives.
Following all these people in the book, first of all, how did you decide on who to follow? Much openness and honesty was agreed upon?
I wanted to follow people across the country. My fear when I started was that these delays were only happening, in the big cities like in New York or Los Angeles. But as I cast a really wide net, I had interviews with about 50 people to start with, and just wanted to find people everywhere. So there's a guy in the book who's in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And I wanted to talk to people of all races, all sexual orientations, and then disparate incomes, although everyone in the book is middle class, because the middle class is so big right now that I thought that I could look at that and still get a wide range of life choices and financial situations. And so I ended up drilling it down to about 15 people that I then started to have extended conversations with, and gradually winnowed that down to 8 people, in part because of where they were in their life and what milestone they were going after, but also because, like you point out, they were just really honest with me and very open, and there was no filter as far as saying, like, I had a down day, will I ever get to this thing, I don't know if this is going to happen for me. And I am so grateful to those old 8 people for sharing their stories and letting me into their lives. And I was a complete stranger and said, can I talk to her? And then I said, oh, can we make it another year?
Can you see a movie coming from this? Because
It. So if you want to put it out there, yes, absolutely.
I just did put it out there.
Thank you, Shelley.
So what have you learned in this process?
I have learned a ton. And obviously, like we talked about at the beginning, I started out, I wasn't alone. And if anything, I feel less alone. And I do think that these delays and these approaching these milestones on our own timelines and zigging and zagging has only intensified during the COVID-19 pandemic. These delays are even greater. People aren't getting married because they may not be able to have a wedding. They're moving back in with their parents. The birth rate is at the lowest it's been in 35 years. So this story is actually more true now than when I started the book.
Anything else you'd like to add, or that you want our listeners to know about your book?
I get this question a lot about if people in their 30s are still largely positive, because I think, we started out as a generation as this, do-gooder, enthusiastic group of people. And I do think that people are still largely positive about arranging their lives the way they want. There's been setbacks, there's been failures, we're up against a lot of tough things, but I still do think that this is a positive story.
Don't you feel that every generation had, some monumental challenge to overcome? I mean, we had, the Vietnam War, where brothers and fathers and were shipped off to a war that they didn't want to, they were drafted. I mean, the military was a totally different situation, and we were at war with our parents, and we thought we were going to have a revolution.
That is really interesting that you bring up that, because I'm sure you remember during that time, a big slogan was, don't trust anyone over 30. Like 30 was so old.
There's one other thing to keep in mind when it comes to these artificial deadlines, if I should be here when I'm so old, and that is that we are living longer lives. And so you have a lot more time than you think that you think you might have. I mean, hopefully we all do. But anyway, thank you so much, Kayleen Schaefer, author of But So Young, How 30 Somethings Are Redefining Adulthood. And coming up next, for those of us desperately missing live concerts, I will have the makers of the new documentary, Long Live Rock. They're next, Q104.3.
New York's classic rock, Q1043.